Thank you all for coming out. Today's roundtable is called Creating Sustainable Careers in Student Affairs. My name is James Bauman. I'm the ACUOI Director of Publications and the editor of The Talking Stick. I'm very excited for today's program because it's an opportunity for us to sort of expand and beyond some stories we had in a recent issue of The Talking Stick. Hopefully you've all had a chance to see those as well. Your membership dollars help fund today's program, The Talking Stick, and all of ACUOI's efforts. We sincerely thank you for your support and being with us today and every day. Along with our publications, I would encourage all of you to take advantage of our online community. On our YouTube page, we host recordings of our virtual roundtables and other programs such as this. And we've also, in recent months, obviously been spending a great deal of time and effort preparing COVID-19 resources to help everybody as they have dealt with the pandemic, from moving students off campus and now moving students back on and preparing for that as well. I would also be remiss not mention that registration is now open for our October conference series. If you are focused on academic initiatives, business operations, or housing facilities, I would strongly recommend being a part of these. Very valuable, focused content. Those information about the programs and our special registration offers are available online at acuo-i.org. Now, a few quick housekeeping notes about today's presentation. We have had a lot of success and got nice feedback on having very conversationally based roundtables. So this is not a traditional webinar where we're going to speak at you. This is an opportunity for you to connect, be a part of the webinar with your questions. You can use the Q&A button on your Zoom menu to be able to post a question. We'll be monitoring, feel free to post those as they come up. We'll be monitoring those, and we'll be opening it up to that discussion later on. Let us know your name, position, institution, along with your question, just so we know who we're dealing with and we can introduce you that way. Let's do a quick little test. If everybody could click the raised hand button, just so I could see that people are being able to hear us and see us. Very positive, reassuring to see all those hands coming up. So that's fantastic. Thank you very much for that. So without further ado then, I'm going to pass the session over to our moderator, Dr. Tony Cawthon. He's the Director of Graduate Studies at Clemson University. He the ones that threw questions out to Dr. Margaret Sally, who was the editor of the book, and compiled those for the story in The Talking Stick. He's going to be the one leading our conversation today, along with our authors and panelists, and I will now turn it over to Tony and let him take it from here. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. I appreciate the opportunity, and I look forward to the conversation we're going to have today. I think it's an exciting one. We appreciate all of you joining us, in particular our panelists. As James said, my name is Tony Cawthon, and I'm a faculty member at Clemson University in the Higher Ed and Student Affairs program here, and serve as the Director of Graduate Studies. Before we go much further, I want to give each of the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about where they work and what they do. So if we could have them do that real quickly. Margaret, you want to start?
You got it. Thanks, Tony. My name is Margaret Salih. I use she and her pronouns. I am a faculty member at the University at Buffalo in the Department of Educational Leadership and Policy. I think I'll leave it there.
All right, thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jenny Jones-Boss. I work at the University of Georgia in the Counseling and Human Development Services, and I work across our College Student Affairs Administration and Student Affairs Leadership programs.
Hello, everyone. I'm Shannon Staten. I'm the Executive Director of University Housing at Florida State University, and I have Housing and the Child Care Early Learning Program and Center under my purview.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Amy Hershey from the University of Louisville, where I'm a faculty member in the College Student Personnel Program.
Thank all of you very much. It's great to have the editor of this forthcoming book and some of the contributing authors to share a little bit of insight with us today. As James said, we hope this is interactive. We're going to start with just me giving a little bit of overview of the book and sort of reaction to the book to give some context. The book hopefully is coming out in November, so you're sort of getting a sneak peek. So there's your Kuho dollars at work. And then we've got some questions for our panelists, but we really hope you will engage and ask the questions you need to help you better understand and implement and use of this book with that. So that will sort of be our agenda and where we'll be headed from there. Just to give you some context in terms of the book, the book will be coming out in November. And the purpose of the book is clearly stated early on. Margaret clearly does a really good job saying it's to explore the impact of ideal worker norms on student affairs. There are 3 parts to the book. The first section of the book, I think, has 5 chapters that sort of examine the structure of student affairs work by institutional type, by functional area, for example, and Amy and Shannon's chapter on housing and residence life. Section 2 is 3 chapters that sort of look at the emotional toll and the psychological toll of working in student affairs has on us as individuals. And the last chapter, or the last section, has 6 chapters that look at how identity groups navigate work, life issues, and so forth. And so that would be, example would be Jenny and Nicole's article on student affairs professionals of color. There are other identity groups as part of that. The book ends with a concluding chapter that sort of pulls it all together, where Margaret offers some excellent individual and institutional practices that we can implement. So from a personal standpoint, I have to tell you, I love the book. It forces us to re-examine how we think about student affairs work and student affairs practice. It perfectly illustrates, I think, the impact of this concept of the ideal worker norms on us, both personally and professionally. It was extremely pertinent pre-COVID. It's definitely pertinent more so now post-COVID in many ways as we're thinking about how to redo our work. So for me, it would be required reading for all student affairs professionals and students in our program, but I can't mandate that. But that's exactly what I think about the book. I loved it that much. So let's go ahead and get started. My first question is going to really be for Margaret. I know for Margaret, this book was a labor of love and a personal project with you, Margaret, and you talk a little bit about that in the book. But just to get us started and give us some perspective, can you talk about and share with participants a little bit about what this ideal worker norm is referring to and how it impacts us both personally and professionally as a profession?
You got it. Thanks, Tony. So ideal worker norms were coined, I guess, about 30 years ago now by Joan Acker and Joan Williams simultaneously. They were writing at the same time. And basically the ideal worker is somebody who is available all the time for the organization, working 40 hours a week or more, and critically, has a wife at home, and I use that language very intentionally, a wife at home to take care of children. So the ideal worker basically is supposed to be a heterosexual, cisgender, white man who has no childcare responsibilities in the home. There's a lot that we unpack in the book about the ideal worker. Additionally, the ideal worker is supposed to be emotionless, right? And does not procreate, so that there are no reasons that the person would be taken away from the job. Some of the chapters, like Tony, you mentioned, explore the emotional impact of ideal worker norms and the emotional impact of student affairs work. And this is exactly where it comes into play, right? That we expect that student affairs professionals can handle the trauma and the secondary trauma of working with students who are going through some significant things. And the ideal worker suggests that, yes, it's fine, that we can turn things off and do our job and be fine and be unimpacted. So sort of to sum up, right, the key points to take away: the ideal worker works all the time. They have no responsibilities in the home, or they have a wife there. A man has a wife. A woman can't have a wife to take care of their kids. And of course, all of this is deeply problematic, and all of this is very gendered. So I'm sure people listening do you want to follow up, Tony?
I was just going to say, I'm sure a member of our people listening probably feel and heard everything you just said.
Right. That's exactly it. That's exactly what I was going to say. Great minds. Right. And I mean, I could start talking about the ways in which student affairs depends on the ideal worker norms, but I'm pretty sure all the participants there, and I'm delighted to see some familiar names on the participant list too, can talk about that too, right? So there's an expectation if we think about student activities. Student activities work takes place at all hours and on weekends. Residence life work and housing work, of course, has the same 24/7 responsibilities. And I don't want to steal Amy and Shannon's thunder, so I will let them talk more about that when we get to them. But there's just this expectation that folks are always available. And as I'm sure people can imagine, ideal worker norms have significant consequences. They lead to burnout. They lead to compassion fatigue, right? If you're handling and you're working with fairly heady issues, you get exhausted. And it also leads to attrition from the profession. We know that about 50% of the student affairs field leaves within the first 5 years. And my argument, and all of our arguments in the book, is that's partially due to the expectations that are placed on the field, that we put our needs behind those of the students. That's what it was in February. I think I could argue that it's only gotten worse in the last 6 months. I think, partially everybody is scrambling to figure out what to do now in this, it's not post-COVID world, it's during COVID world, right? And I would argue that, again, there are particular areas that are more impacted than others. The residence life staff I see being particularly impacted, and I also see student activity staff. These are the two functional areas that I think are being required more than others to be on campus and to literally put their bodies and their lives on the line in ways that folks in other areas aren't. So that's where we would start with ideal worker norms.
Okay, great. I think, and your book does a really good job, I think, sort of unpacking that on so many levels. And you sort of gave me a good segue there to ask Shannon and Amy, who wrote the chapter on housing and residence life, to talk a little bit about your chapter. Your chapter, you framed around this concept of boundary theory. And I'm not sure a lot of folks are that familiar with boundary theory. So can you share a little bit with participants about what boundary theory is, why it's important, and how it sort of framed your chapter?
Sure, Tony, thanks. So boundary theory offers a framework to examine the tensions of navigating personal and professional roles. And you think about boundaries, you think about edges. And so these are the edges of work and non-work areas of our lives. And those edges can be separate, or they can separate from each other, or they can overlap, and it really depends on the person, the context. Christina Nippert-Eng offered a continuum to categorize how individuals situate themselves across these realms of work and home. And so she identified a continuum that has two poles. On one side, it's integration, and on the other side, it's segmentation. And so really, you could, of course, there on a continuum, there are lots of points in between. There are different kinds of boundaries, and I'll just share a quick definition and an example in housing and residence life. So there's physical boundaries that make sense, living and working on campus at the same time. When a person lives where they work, they continuously cross thresholds between work and personal spaces, making it more difficult to define and maintain separation if that's what they want. A second kind of boundary has to do with time management. And that signifies the control, or sometimes the lack of control, that individuals have in scheduling work and personal time. You think about staff, the staff expectation of staff to regularly check and answer work emails, phone calls, text messages at home, and sometimes at all hours. Another example, work situations often interfere with personal plans. So you have to deal with what comes up when it comes up. A third type of boundary is psychological boundary. We've mentioned already a little bit, and then we'll get into it more, about compassion fatigue for supporting others through crises. And then the fourth kind of boundary is an interpersonal boundary. And that refers to the way housing and residence life staff manage their interactions with others based on whether they're working or not. And so an example of that is new professionals sometimes struggle with how to communicate guidelines about when their student staff should contact them or how they should contact them outside work hours without seeming to be unavailable or seeming like they're uncaring.
Yeah, and I really like that part of the chapter where you all talked about grad staff and Livein staff have to become their own advocate to clarify with student leaders, their RAs and other student leaders about when I'm working and when I'm not. And then you did a nice job taking that through how career mid-managers need to become advocates to create home-like environments for those people living in. I think my question for Shannon would be, as a senior student affairs officer, how do you do that? How do you support staff that are living in to combat this idea of this ideal worker and battling compassion fatigue? What are some strategies for doing that?
You know, the difficult thing is that there are things you can control and things you can't control. So there are HR guidelines and university institutional cultural pieces that you have to follow, right? But I think that the senior housing officer and the lead staff in that program can, one, change our own background, our own thought process. So that thought process of how we used to do it. We lived in, we did the same thing, we made it through it, but we didn't like it then either. It's just we couldn't say anything then. So I think we have to change our process and we have to model it. We have to be able to show that if we are serious about time management and about the way you can separate and use your boundary concepts to separate work and life, then we have to be able to model that ourselves. So one of the things that's a challenge is that we are all reporting to VPs and presidents and others who don't really have those boundaries either, but we have to do things that we show that we're trying. So leaving the office at 5 o'clock instead of working until 8 and 9 each night in our offices shows staff that we can leave and they can leave, that you can go home and have dinner. And you may work later, but it's because you're choosing to and not because you're still in your office and you're missing everything going on at home. And so whether you have a family at home or you live by yourself, you still need that separation time. So showing that you can do that. One of the things I think, Tony, that's really important is acknowledging that this compassion fatigue is real. And when you were talking a minute ago about COVID and everything with this pandemic, that is probably one of the most strenuous pieces of everything I've seen in res life is that compassion fatigue. You know, our staff never went home. They stayed and worked on campus all summer. The custodial, the maintenance, but the live-in staff were there. That's where they lived. They were working with residents. And so that worrisome of I may catch it because I'm not able to control and isolate myself somewhere else. And then just the changing in workloads and work methods all summer to manage what we had to do. It's hard, it's strenuous, and that's a psychological piece as much as a physical piece. So I think that as a senior officers, we have to be able to show that. We need to do things like adjust work schedules, not just suggest it, not say, hey, when you're on call, if you're tired, you've had a long weekend, take some extra hours off, but to say when you're on call, well, how are you adjusting your schedule this week? Show me what you're doing to change your work schedule so that you're getting yourself a break, because we know what kind of hours you're going to work after hours and on the weekend. So we have to show and model that and be able to help them figure it out. They need to ask, but they're not going to because they worry about everything from what that'll do for my future to how you'll take that when I say it. And I think we need to be very careful about receiving and acknowledging those ideas and those concerns of our staff in a way that's genuine and authentic. And we say, all right, let's try to figure it out. Another thing I thought about is with the physical space, you talked about it a moment ago as well. Why do we have people live in? We have them live in because we want professional staff available for students because of crisis moments, because of things that happen when the offices are closed. But do they have to live in the building they work? So one easy thing is just shaking that up a little bit and changing our concept and letting staff live in apartments and buildings that they're not assigned to, so that when they go home, and they're out in their hallway, or they're going to the laundry, or they're taking the trash out, people don't necessarily know who they are because they're not part of that community. And we don't think about those things, that we just need to shake up the way we think through that. Apartments, we try to make apartments nice, but there's ways we could upgrade those apartments to make them feel more like a private home might. You know, everything from the kitchen appliances and the way the kitchens are set up to trying to provide laundry. It's really difficult in older buildings to do some of those things, but we could certainly do some finishes and work that would make it feel better, and work with our staff on that. What is it you'd like to see? How can you live there? If we can offer ways for staff to come and go without being seen in the hallways, if they can have an external door entrance and their own private patio area where they can come and go and not have to, every time they're out in the hallway, be stopped by someone. I talk about that after we talked about how that goes. And we could do that. Just one second. I'm going to, someone, of course a call comes in on my computer. So we can do that. But I think the other thing is as simple as, how are we working and showing our staff to work? If we're sending emails at night, then we're not showing them it's okay to have separation and it's okay to turn off the work. So we need to think about how we send our emails, how we're doing our phone calls, when are we reaching out to our staff. And it's okay to work at night if that's what you do, but time activate your emails so they don't go till the next day, because we all know that if you get an email, you're going to read it. And if you read it, then you think you have to act on it. And there's not a way for staff to be able to turn that off. So we need to make sure that we're showing that. Now, I have found that during pandemic time in the last 6 months, it's been difficult in that sense. You know,
It's even harder.
You know, we're working long days, we're working every day of the week because everything changes so often with everything we need to know and do. And I've put that off on my staff some. And so I had to stop myself a couple of weeks ago and say, okay, we're going to shift here. And I'm not going to send you an email after hours unless I really need you to. I'm not going to worry about you having everything I know in your head as you get up in the morning. Just trust me that I'll help you know what I need you to know, and you can ask me questions. But I found myself going back into a path that I had gotten away from because I work really hard at not doing things like sending emails, calling staff, trying to ask them questions when it's not emergency after hours. But I think those are some simple things we can do. It's all about taking control over your internal processes and not trying to do anything else.
Yeah, I think those are great strategies. And as one who's taking his furlough day on Friday and about to have a nervous breakdown that I can't read email, this whole topic is resonating with me. So, I like the, I like the conversation we're having about fatigue, whether it's compassion fatigue or battle fatigue, which sort of brings me to shift the conversation a little bit to Jenny. Jenny and Nicole wrote a beautifully written chapter on encounter spaces, and I love that word, and I wish I could show it how they did it in the chapter with the EN in parentheses. Jenny, you all did a nice job talking about the extra burden and the extra burden that student affairs professionals of color experience in terms of compassion, battle fatigue, taking up battles that are just, they take up battles because it's part of their identity. Can you share a little bit about your concept of encounter spaces and how you all can offer some suggestions for how student affairs professionals of color can navigate their work to minimize that?
Sure.
There's a lot in that question.
There is a lot in that, and I'll add into my response. I'll talk a little bit about what professionals of color can do, but I really want to focus my time more on what white professionals can do, because a lot of this is about the added labor that professionals of color take up, and part of encounter spaces is a call for white professionals to take up some of that work and relieve some of that burden from professionals of color. So our concept of encounter spaces comes out of critical race theory, and particularly the concept of counter storytelling, where in CRT, critical race theory, they talk about counter storytelling as a way for people of color to tell their stories and raise the consciousness about racism that is very ubiquitous, particularly in US culture, and even really globally. But so in encounter spaces, what we talk about is a space for professionals of color to be able to talk about and share those stories when they feel moved to do so or when they need to do so for purposes of healing. It's this idea of understanding the power of narrative to not only make the invisible visible, but also to facilitate healing in a number of different ways. And part of it is the encounter part of it. So the counter space comes from the idea of the counter storytelling and really being active about having space for that counter storytelling to happen, both in dominant spaces or in, kind of smaller spaces. But the encounter piece of that is the kind of working together, the kind of coalescing or the coalitions, co-conspirator, kind of space that happens when, white professionals are open to the conversation, have done some work prior to coming to engaging in some of those spaces, and open and willing to listen to the counter stories that professionals of color have to tell about their lives, their lived experiences, their professional experiences on campus. And recognizing that the labor of kind of creating those spaces should not just be the burden of professionals of colors to create. Professionals of color already create lots of spaces on their own behalves in a number of different ways. They're often marginal to our larger spaces in the profession and conferences and even on their own campuses. But this is the idea that white professionals will also take up the labor of creating the space where the voices of professionals of color are centered, valued, and amplified. So that's a very quick kind of idea about the encounter space, but and part of the hope is that then white professionals can leave an encountered space better equipped from an informed place for dismantling structures that are particularly oppressive for professionals of color, and especially when we talk about their intersected identities, not just because of their race, but the other identities that they live in day in and day out. And so certainly for professionals of color, community is a big piece of that, and finding community can sometimes be very difficult. A lot of professionals of color are sometimes the only professional of color, particularly if you start to talk about specific racial representations. They might be the only Black, the only Latinx, the only Asian person in their office, in their division, on their campuses, if their campuses are small enough. And so finding places where they can find community and space to talk about their experience and find some solidarity and support, and folks who won't, be questioning their stories, but be able to really kind of lean in and love on them in that way. But really, our chapter is, I hope to see it and operate as a call to action to white professionals to raise awareness of the working conditions that professionals of color navigate day in and day out, the added labor that they take up on behalf of all students, but particularly students of color, when they're called on explicitly or implicitly to serve those students, to support those students, to be the face, to welcome those students onto campus, not to mention that the students themselves often seek those professionals out because for some of them, it's the first time that they see professionals who look like them, that reflect, their cultural experiences. And so, so I say all that to say that, there's a lot that needs to happen around, white professionals taking up the mantle of checking in on their colleagues of color, giving them the space to share if they want to, and being able to back off, but leave the door open if they don't want to. We've been talking a lot about COVID and the impact there, and it has been difficult for everyone. For professionals of color, it's been difficult in added ways, particularly for Black professionals of color, where weekly, really with more frequency than that, we are bombarded with stories of Black people being subject to state-sanctioned violence, campuses that have woefully inadequate responses to those experiences, and students who are speaking up about ways that that is manifest maybe in lesser ways, but still impactful and still dangerous, violent ways on their campuses, and not being heard around that. So again, offering this this idea that the encounter space is one that is very active in nature. It is one that is taken up by dominant groups to say, you know, we will take up some of the labor to create that space, to hear the stories, and then act.
Yeah, and I think you all did an excellent job sort of with the call to action piece, which really resonated with me, you know, as I read that chapter as a white male of what am I doing, you know, and so I think y'all were very successful. So I hope it has the kind of response that it's intended to bring about change with that. So all of the chapters did. The LGBT chapter, many of the other chapters really moved me to think about action, not just think about ideas, but what could I do better for multiple identity groups in addition to that. So we do have our first question from one of the attendees. So I will go ahead and ask that. It really is framed around the idea that the pandemic has really pushed professionals to a different level of burnout, especially Livein Staff. We talked a little bit about that because they're sort of not only living where they work, but they're also responding to a dangerous virus. And so the question really is targeted for the grad prep faculty on the call. How are you talking to your Livein grads about this? How are they feeling about the profession? And do you feel a sense of responsibility for helping them stay balanced during this time? So I'll sort of open that up to who wants to respond to that. How are you talking to your staff? How are they feeling about the profession? And do you feel a sense of responsibility for helping them stay balanced? I think we have 3 grad prep faculty, so they can jump in.
Okay, I'll jump in first. So I don't have live-in GAs that University of Louisville doesn't have live-in GAs, and so but I feel strongly about responding to the question, especially the last one. Do I feel a sense of responsibility for helping them stay balanced during this time? Absolutely. I think one of the roles that faculty can play is to be a sounding board when students are trying to manage these the role conflict of being a student and being an employee. And so I've had several conversations with students who weren't sure how to advocate for themselves, felt sort of stuck, felt like they wanted to be responsible, but also were fearful for good reason. And so I think Margaret said earlier about student activities and other roles where GAs have to have a lot of interaction with face-to-face interaction with students. So in that way, I've been helpful. I've tried to be helpful to my students who are in those roles.
Margaret, Jeannie, any insights or comments?
Sure. So some of our students this year are live-in GAs, and I've seen a range of comfort. I mean, I have some students who feel no discomfort about being a live-in GA. I actually have a student who's the GA for the quarantine hall, and he is very comfortable with that. You know, I expressed concern, and he said that he's not concerned health-wise at all. What I have noticed, though, is that students are saying that they have even more meetings than before. So whereas last year there were meetings on their schedule, now they're finding more meetings being put on their schedule, which is making it harder to figure out how to balance being a student, right? Which as faculty, we think is their primary responsibility. And then navigate the stress of COVID for some, and then also their academic or their professional responsibilities. So as with Amy, I am always a sounding board with students and figure out what is it that they want to advocate for, and do they need my help as an advocate? I try not to step in when not needed, right? But that's what I'm seeing on our campus.
And I'll echo Margaret and Amy. We do have some live-in staff on in our graduate program. I'm not the graduate coordinator for our master's program, so I don't have first contact with assistantship providers. But one of the things that I have been doing and working with our students that I teach that I have in class is that, Margaret talked about them having more meetings. A lot of our live-in staff have extended on-call hours than they do in regular times. They're kind of on call all the time, or at least that's the way they categorize it to me. I don't know how true that is, but certainly I know that there is that the on-call hours are extended, whether they're on call all the time or just feel that way. But part of it is that, we have a lot of conversations in our class around, we're not progressing in our class with business as usual because we're not in the world as usual. And so talking about what that looks like and making space for them, I always tell them at the end of the day, the learning is important and how we engage the learning is negotiable. And in these times, we all have to be flexible around what that looks like. And so, when I have students who've been on call and they just don't have the bandwidth for class, and they don't come to class, we figure out the learning part of it later. So that's where I feel like on my end of it, where I have some control, I try to create that space for students and, echoing the idea of offering support if they want to advocate or need to advocate for themselves and need tools to do so, or connecting with our graduate coordinator if they actually need someone to step in and do so. But otherwise, just really trying to be available and being flexible on my end of things, so that they know that they have that space prepared for them.
Tony, one thing I would add from a practitioner and from the department is that we can do is, one, make sure that we're not extending beyond their hours each week. They may look different in the work they're doing than they did last year, but if we're paying them or working them 20 hours a week, we need to stay within the 20 hours a week and be able to adjust that and not real easily say, oh, you put in more this week, it's okay, because it isn't okay, and we need to work with that. The thing I'm hearing from the grad students is basic Maslow concerns. If we close down the residence halls, do I have to move out? Well, I have to find somewhere to live because you're closing the halls. That's a good question. The answer is, I'm going to take care of you. But they don't believe that yet. And so I get asked that every time I'm with the group, because they want to know, what happens if we close down? Do we have to move? And I can't guarantee them I won't have to move them out, but I can guarantee them I'm going to take care of them. We're going to figure it out. You won't be homeless all of a sudden because you live in a residence hall that has an issue. So
I think
needs are high on their list right now.
Yeah, and I think for me, when I have my conversations with our grads, it's the combination of that you can be excited that you're finally getting to do what you were hired to do, but you can also be anxious. One doesn't come at the expense of the other. You can be both. You can be excited that students are back, but you can be as scared as crap, for your own safety. And how do you balance that? So to me, that is it's a concept they don't seem to get, that they can experience both of those. So it's interesting with that. So I appreciate your perspective there. Another question that's come in talks about building community and how we built community traditionally on our campuses, and that there are lessons we need to be learning from this experience called COVID. And how do you all think we will go about building community and as a community of workers in the future to do those things that are fundamental to what we do? When you think about building community, will it look different? How will it look different? How will the expectation of workers impact that building community? For all of us, building community is central to who we are as a campus. Any thoughts?
I'll start with that. I think it goes beyond building community for the students as well, because our staff on campus, whether they live in or they don't, student affairs staff are a community. That's one of the great things about working in student affairs, is that you like each other, you hang with each other, you do things together, and we can't do that. We can't have big gatherings, and we can't just say, let's all go out and get a drink after work and just see how everybody's doing. And so that has shifted, and I think it's brought more stress right now because people don't feel like they're connecting other than the Zoom meetings of the day, because it's just difficult to do. And that's both whether you live in or not. I think that's a student affairs piece.
Other comments related to that? And there may not be. There's some more questions, so I can move us on. All right, so one of the other questions that folks have been asking about is the job search process. It looks different. It looked different last year. It looks different this year. You have any insights for how candidates can go about learning the worker expectations on the campuses they're interviewing for, and how they can do that on the front end versus the back end?
In some ways, I don't actually think that doing the search virtually changes things. In terms of, you're still in an artificial environment speaking with folks, right? But I do think that asking all sorts of questions of all sorts of people is the way you get that information. You know, I think I am a qualitative researcher, and one of my favorite questions for asking in interviews is, walk me through what a typical day looks like for you, starting from when you wake up in the morning to when you go to bed at night. And that you can easily ask that exact same question of folks who you are interviewing with, right? You can ask that of your supervisors. You can, and I know that, you know, people do day-long interviews where they're talking with different groups, so they can talk with prospective peers about that. They can talk with students, right? And really just ask probing questions to try and figure out what's life like on that campus. And I think that there are a number of resources people can try and track down virtually to figure out what the life is like on that campus as well. But, and I'll leave those for other folks to talk about, but really just asking pointed questions or subtle questions to try and get the information that how people spend their time. And if that feels like that is how you want to spend your time, because it's possible I may ask these questions in an interview and it sounds terrific to me, and Amy asked the same questions and it sounds terrible to her, right? So we're all trying to find what it is that appeals to us.
I think maybe connected to your question about community, Tony, particularly in student affairs community, I think for folks who are on the job market, to think about the kind of creative ways that you can connect with other folks who work at institutions who are not on the search committee. Because I think sometimes it can be daunting to ask the questions you really want to ask to the search committee. And so I have, you know, on job searches or even working with students on job searches, gone to places like Facebook and, you know, say, search for folks who work at this institution and say, would you be willing to chat with me for, you know, even 5 or 10 minutes about what it's like to work on that campus? Even if they're not in your functional area, you can get some clues about campus culture, what the climate is, and different things like that. So I think that there's some other ways that you can do some information gathering that might help inform you as to the work culture on that campus.
Yeah, we try to connect our students to our alumni who might work at that institution and say they're a great source, because they'll tell you the truth with that. We do have another question that really intrigues me, and I'm trying to read it. It's a fairly long question, but I'm going to try to paraphrase it. The person is asking the question that from their perspective, many tenured, seasoned folks don't necessarily recognize this idea of ideal worker and the impact it's having. I think Margaret sort of got at this a little bit earlier. And not because they don't care or because they're not open to it, it's because the work they do now has become normalized for them. And so that leads to this sense of attrition. And so the person is asking, what are the panelists' thoughts on how you reframe this conversation and keep good people in the profession?
My first thought about this is, honestly, I think this needs to be an issue that the professional associations take up. You know, both associations like ACUOI, but really NASPA and ACPA, right? Because it's a policy issue in a lot of ways. I think a little bit about and my knowledge here is a little sketchy, right? But with that med schools, med students and residents used to be subjected to long days on call, and that's been shortened. And the reason it was is that everybody else had done it. And so we just figured, let's perpetuate the system, right? But then there was a policy change that made that illegal. It's still long days, but not, not 72 hours. So I think that we have to have conversations on the individual level. And, you know, Shannon is role modeling for us, right? How senior officers can engage, and she can have conversations with folks at her level. And I think those conversations are equally important. But I think a little bit about, unless we're having these conversations nationally, I worry that the road to change will be a lot longer.
Yeah, definitely. Others, have you any comments?
I was just going to say, I agree with what Margaret was saying, because I can work however I can work within my system for my department, but it doesn't help me educate the rest of the campus on why there's a difference in the way staff are working, correct? And so I think that the associations could help frame that for our presidents and our vice presidents and the leadership of the campus, that there is a difference and we have to think through what those look like. So advocating is one way to do that, and just trying to help others understand what it's like, because, you know, right now student affairs staff are the ones that are usually called on in emergencies to make sure things happen. Who gets to run the hurricane shelters? You know, it's the student affairs team. Who's doing this, who's doing that? And part of that's because we know the students, we know how to work with the students, but then when you try to get assistance with that, it's really difficult. So I think we have to keep advocating for and educating our campuses and our administrations on what it means, what the old ideal worker was, and how we need to shift into what a new ideal worker is. A new ideal worker for me is someone that we can value, that is able to speak up, is able to adjust and manage their time and manage their expectations without being fearful that they will be punished for that. And I don't know that we'll ever get there, but that sure would be my ideal with it.
And if I can add one quick thing, you know, I think certainly this has to happen on an institutional level at the associations and on our campuses. But I think on an individual level too, we have to check our internalized sense of the ideal worker and the way that we perpetuate that. Because I think that kind of inherent in this question is this idea that, you know, folks who've been in it for a while, they almost think like, oh, well, that's just part of the process, right, of being a student affairs professional. And we have to challenge that narrative. And I think that it's hard because we went through it, so others should have to go through it too. But, you know, if we're really trying to create a better world and a better profession, then we have to, you know, challenge our kind of own notions to want to uphold that structure.
One of the things I try to do is catch myself, Jenny, as you're saying that, when if I feel a certain way about the way someone says, right? And I stop myself and go, okay, I feel a certain way about that. Is that right or is that wrong? Should I adjust my way or should I help them with their way? And it's both ways, it's both directions. Many times when I get that feeling, I need to check myself and I need to say, whoa, wait, they're right. But how do we get them to where we need to be so we both can get what we need? And that's, yeah, but that's my own personal thing, is if I hear myself saying, I feel a certain way about that, I know I have to stop and really evaluate what's going on and why I feel that.
I just think this conversation has the potential to be a great national conversation where you bring together professional staff, students, and grad prep faculty to have an honest conversation. And if we could convince the ACPAs and the NASPAs to do that, I think it could change the direction of our profession, and it's what we should be doing. I don't know how we do it, but I think it gives us the opportunity to bring all the constituent groups to come and talk about that. Just because I had to walk through the sand in the wind doesn't mean you have to. You know, that's how hazing continues. So, yeah. Amy, were you going to say something that I cut you off?
No, I was going to build on what you said. I really like that idea of bringing folks together. I'm just thinking, one of our bedrock values really in student affairs is supporting the whole person. And so we do that we just do a great job we try to do a great job with students. If we can use that, and this is one of the major themes of Margaret's book, if we can treat ourselves as the way that we want to treat students, so we strive to treat students, then I think we can better align our values. And so it's right now, to me, there's a wide gap in how we support each other in the work that we're doing in being balanced. So I think that connecting to our core bedrock values in student affairs is a good idea.
Yeah, I think that's a great sort of thing for us all to remember and to take heart and to not lose sight of. Well, we only have about 8 minutes left, and so I want to give a little bit of opportunity for each of you to share sort of lessons learned, final thought, final thing you want the participants to hear, to take away from this conversation. We'll let Margaret go last and let her have the last word. But I'd ask the other three folks if you could sort of start us off by, now that you've done this, had this experience, writing the chapter, being a part of this project, what do you want people to take away? What do you want them to remember, or what insight would you share?
I'm first in the alphabet, so I'll go first. Much of how I approach my teaching in the classroom is founded on lessons I learned when I worked in housing and residence life for 13 years. And examples of that: building community, fostering peer relationships, encouraging reflection, and having really difficult conversations while maintaining good relationships. A lesson that I did not learn in housing and residence life, but I've gotten better about, is to be more realistic about the time and the energy required to manage the complexity of the work. And so my lesson learned, I would say prioritize what's most important and look for things to eliminate, because you can't really do everything, especially, and this is my big aha for the various pandemics that we're experiencing right now. So in short, do less better.
Okay, I like that. Really figure out what's important and do it and let the other go. All right, Shannon, Jenny, any final thoughts from you?
I think for me, it came down to work with what you can control and educate what you can't. So to really analyze what you can do, where you can make changes, what you can be as a community or as a team within your program, and how individually and as a group, how can I control that? I can walk away from the office at 5 o'clock. I may have to work again later tonight, but I can make that known that I leave when, when the office closes, or that type of thing. We can control that. And then educate what we can't control and hoping to change some of that.
Yeah, as a good sociology undergraduate, I'm reminded of my sphere of control conversation every day. I can't control Clemson, but I can be the best faculty member in my class. So I think we could all be remiss to not remember about this idea of this sphere of control. So I think that's a great suggestion as well.
And then I'll just say quickly before Margaret jumps in here with all the gems I know she'll offer us. No pressure, sorry about that. But I think, I want to kind of connect back to something that Amy mentioned. And I think, holding that tension of staying true to some of the early parts of the profession, right? This idea of valuing the whole person. And really looking at what feels congruent or incongruent in our lives and the way that we frame and think about our work, and ways that we can try to find congruence in our sphere of influence, if I can connect to what other folks have said, that we can find that, but also ways that where we have power, can push against, incongruencies. And I think that goes to the education piece that you were speaking to, Shannon, there for sure. But I think that that's important, going through this, working on this chapter, and then looking at the brilliant work that other people have contributed to this book. I think that there's a lot inherent in that that's about a call to us remembering what this work is really supposed to be about and how we've kind of lost our way in the way that we've held people to different working standards. So.
Yeah, that was my summary after reading the whole book. This is a great call to action to do our work better, but still honor our history and values of what worked and then let go of the other that didn't. So, Margaret, you get the last word. Not a lot of pressure, but we have put a lot of pressure on you.
Now there is a lot of pressure. You know, and I think I wrote about this in the piece for Talking Stick about one of the chapters in the book, an outstanding chapter. It was talked about us care versus self-care, right? And that we really, there's so much talk nationally about engaging in self-care, right? How do we take care of ourselves? How do we carve out more time? Whatever this is, if we're talking about work-life balance. But really, we need to shift the conversation to us care. How do we take care of everybody around us? How do we use our privilege, whatever that privilege is, if it's, you know, white folks using their white privilege, if it's folks in senior positions using their, you know, their status to advocate for the kind of field and the kind of society we want to see. So that's really my what I hope folks take away is how can we each act, but act as a collective to return student affairs to this field that is, of course, supporting students holistically, but applying that same notion to supporting its staff as well.
Well, and I loved your analogy of us care back to the mask and COVID. That analogy that you gave there, that's about protecting others. So I think that's a great way to end, a great summary. I want to thank all of you all for participating and thank all of our participants for joining us. I hope you will all rush out and purchase this book. I think it's going to be a life-changing book and one we all need to have in our library as we move forward. So James, I will turn it back over to you to wrap us up.
Thank you very much, Tony. I certainly appreciate it. And to Tony, Margaret, Jenny, Amy, and Shannon, thank you all so much for your insight and your time, both today and then also in the book. This session has been recorded. It will be available as soon as possible on the ACULI YouTube channel so that people can find it there. And you know, please share it with your other staff. Share it with your supervisor if you feel you need to have better balance in your life and your work. But also, please keep your eye out for the ACULI Connections email newsletter and our website for all the different virtual roundtables and virtual events and resources that we have coming up. Again, thank you so much for everybody for your time. This has been a fantastic program. And I said, without hyperbole, working on the couple stories in the Talking Stick here, I think were some of the most impactful ones that I've had a chance to work with during all my time here. I think this is a fantastic resource for everybody in the profession. And quite honestly, there's a lot of good lessons for people outside the profession as well. So thank you all.